Hey everybody, welcome to the Big Liberty Show. I'm your favorite fat boy, Big Daddy Liberty. Special interview today. I have the Premier of the Western Cape, Helen Zille, who we're going to have a nice chat about around two things essentially. One, what does it mean to be a liberal or a classical liberal in government here in South Africa? Especially with the regulatory burden and, all the things that one has to conform to. And secondly, it's at the end of what has been 2 terms of government of the Democratic Alliance here in the Western Cape. Her reflections on this, and specifically on the State of the Province address that she delivered last week on Friday. But with that being said, let me welcome the Premier to the show. Premier, welcome to the Big Liberty Show. Thank you for joining me. Let me get straight into it. Premier, you had a let's say, interesting time during the SOPA with the ANC deciding to grandstand, as it always does in these particular events. But this time it was rather special, wasn't it, with them walking out?
Well, that was a set piece. They had planned to do that. And I could see that they were already packing up before their leader, Kaya Magaka, got up to say, "We're now going to leave." Yes. He tried to make it look spontaneous, but it was very staged. And I knew they were going to have to do something, because they couldn't let us have the stage to tell our story with all the extraordinary statistics of positive developments for the province. And so they had to make sure that the headlines were about them walking out, about them staging an alternative, and about their critique. And to some extent, that always works.
Helen, on this particular issue, and I'm going to segue back to perhaps where I began in terms of introducing this segment, and that was, being a liberal in government. What has been your understanding of that just before? Maybe just take me back to when you just found out that you've won, the party's just won the Western Cape. Surely this thought must have crossed your mind. What does a liberal in government do? And then take me to maybe this point, you delivering your final SOPA, a liberal in government. Your thoughts on this?
This is a very important question, because up till 2009, when we just won the Western Cape with an overall majority, I'd been managing coalitions.
Yeah.
And managing coalitions is about compromise and holding things together. And it's really hard to implement your vision and your policy platform in government when you're doing a lot of compromising. And I expected to be doing exactly the same in province, and then suddenly we had this marvelous overall majority. So you could suddenly be a liberal in government and actually implement your policy platform. And I think the biggest barrier to that is the general mindset of South Africans. If you take the 2 core ideas of liberalism, the first is the primacy of the individual.
That's right.
The value of the individual to chart their course in life, to have the opportunities they need to live a life they value, and the role of government being to facilitate, encourage, and create those conditions. And that is something that South Africa's never ever experienced before, and it's certainly not the mindset of government in any way at all, and often not the mindset of people in the DA. And the biggest challenge I found was that people thought that we were the administrative arm of national government. So they felt that if anything contradicted national government's policy, we couldn't touch it. And I said, not at all. We have our own policy platform, and the Constitution allows provinces far more power than they've ever used or ever understood.
That's right.
Now, that was a very frightening concept for many of the people in government, and many of them had come in from the ANC. And I said to them, listen, if you're prepared to implement the voters' mandate, which is our policy platform, you're welcome to stay on the basis of whether you're actually performing. And to get round that mindset of this isn't national government policy and national government wants us to do things differently, that was a huge obstacle. That brings me to the next principle of liberalism, which is the idea of human fallibility, that people get things wrong.
That's right.
And so that everything must be open to question and debate. It's not a hierarchy of command structure. Obviously, you have to have accountability and you have to report in certain lines, but you've got to be open to the fact that you may be wrong. And you've always got to ensure that your policies are having the impact you intend, not the kind of impact that enables you to tick a box. So to ensure that you are actually doing what you think you're doing, because you're totally cut off in the upper echelons of government, to govern for results and not for ticking boxes and reporting is another massive hurdle that has to be overcome in government. And of course, it's only possible if you have the liberal approach to say, I may have been wrong, this may not be working, let's go and check, rather than this is the policy, this is what you do because I said so. And that is a fundamental mind shift in government.
Helen, I think there is a great difficulty for a lot of people, especially those, maybe even like me, who are very specific on issues of liberty and, classical liberalism. We often level the criticism to the DA, for example, in government. Oh, they're not liberal enough, and they're not doing things in a liberal way. It can be unfair, but at times actually can also be quite apt, especially when it comes to issues of the creeping in of bad ideas. Ideas, because the trappings of power and the trappings of governance can sometimes pervert an agenda, a liberal agenda that you may have set out to the voting public in your manifesto. Tell me briefly, how easy or difficult has it been to deliver on a stated agenda for government in your manifesto when you then came into power? What were the dynamics that one really, from a leadership perspective, has to deal with in leading a cabinet?
Well, the biggest difficulty is to turn strategy into implementation. In fact, it's come to a point where I say strategy is implementation.
That's right.
And in government, it is so hard to ensure that through the long chain of delivery with all of the different components and at scale, people don't understand the scale of government. If you're managing one school or one institution, like a health center, for example, that's a completely different scale from managing an entire system for results. So strategy is implementation, and that is the most complex thing there is in government. And that is why we implemented a specific methodology in our second term, when we got all the basic systems right, that mapped out where we were going very specifically, what success looked like, what we were trying to achieve, put statistics to it, put indicators to it, and then got the data that we needed to measure every step of the way whether we were making progress. It's a labor-intensive, very focused methodology, but on priorities of government, because you can't do it for everything, on priorities of government, that is the way to follow through. Otherwise, you end up in a kind of amorphous mess, and what I call the wheelbarrow model of government. You take a decision, you think it's being implemented, you go back a year later for a report back, and the wheelbarrow has been left where you last saw it. There it is. So the wheelbarrow hasn't moved since you last saw it. So what you have to do is prioritize in government. There are things that have to continue, and they're very important things. But if you say during this term, there are these 5 things we really want to achieve, and they've got to be quite big things, quite difficult things, but they have to largely fall within your mandate. And those things can be managed in a totally different way. And you have to be hands-on, and you have to know what's happening on the ground, and you have to understand every blockage and get it out of the way. And those are manifold in government.
I'm going to throw a bit of a spanner in the works here.
Curveball. It wouldn't be you if you didn't.
And in me doing this, I'm going to go back to maybe that point I was trying to sort of drive out around, the criticism we often level at, what should be a liberal government, so to speak, and what eventually becomes a government that governs by, or as it should, a myriad of regulations and laws that are, Helen, if I were to put it to you and say that this DA government in the last 10 years has not delivered on a mandate of placing as much power and resources away from the hands of officials, away from the hands of the state, and into the hands of families and individuals. Really, as classical liberals, we talk a lot about individuals, but really we're a family society. So if I were to put it to you and say, this DA government has not done what it can to put power and resources away from the hands of officials, away from the hands of politicians, and into the hands of families, how do you respond to that?
I think you're right, Sihle. But I've also learned in time that I've made assumptions that turn out not to be valid. For example, when we were negotiating the South African Schools Bill, my point of departure was the classical liberal one, which was to say parents know best, governing bodies know best. They need to have as much power as possible in the system and in the Schools Act, entrenched in law, because no one knows better than parents what their children need, how to govern a school, and how to move forward. That's an assumption that counts perhaps for the middle class. But I've been sorely disillusioned at, for example, the extent of corruption that creeps into governing bodies, at the extent of governing bodies that sell teaching posts.
Sure.
They don't recommend the best person for the job, but they will look at which candidate is prepared to pay them a kickback for being nominated to fill a position. They will quickly get in on schools' discretionary spending to enrich themselves in the feeding scheme and in the transport schemes. I never thought that was possible. And so I thought our best bet is to massively empower the parents. What I never understood was that these would be sites of power struggles within communities, of political power struggles in communities, of people not working with the teachers to ensure the best education for their children, but trying to take over in the most autocratic way. And I made a whole lot of assumptions that turned out not to be valid. And I had to revisit some of them. So the assumptions that most liberals make, and let me be quite frank about that, is that human beings are generally rational and fair. Rational and fair and seeking the best interests of society as a whole, even while they're pursuing their own best interests.
Yeah.
And certainly pursuing the best interests of their children. And I found that not to be the case. So it always comes to me as a surprise when people aren't rational and fair. Still today, I never expect them not to be, although I've had an enormous amount of experience that they aren't. But the assumption that people do pursue the best ends that they are supposed to pursue, even if it's their own best ends, is something that has come home to me as an assumption that isn't always true. Now, the good thing about a society as a whole is that people make mistakes. Of course, that's the assumption of liberalism. People make mistakes. And that's fine. That's why we have a multi-party democracy. That's why we have an independent judiciary. That's why we have all the institutions of the Constitution. But when adults are making mistakes about the best interests of their children, then there's got to be a point at which there is a check and balance on that as well. Now, obviously, there needs to be checks and balances on government, because we mustn't ever pretend to ourselves that we're acting in the best interests of the public without those challenges and without those questions and without going back to be accountable all the time. But governing bodies also have to be held accountable, and it's really very important that those checks and balances are there. So I would be much more cautious today than I was previously about the extent of powers to all governing bodies. And I think it makes sense to have categories of capacity to take that level of responsibility within a school. There's another area, which is alcohol. Now, the classical liberal tradition is government must get the hell out of people's personal lives and not tell people whether to drink and how much to drink and when to drink. True. But when I have seen the ravages of alcohol abuse and what it is doing, 15 years ago, I never saw children neglected because of the alcohol abuse of mothers in townships. I didn't see that in black townships. Today it's everywhere. And what is a government's responsibility as far as that's concerned? Do you just have to leave it and say eventually when there's been enough ravages, people will find a balance? Or do you say we have a responsibility here? These are very, very difficult questions for classical liberals.
I hear you. I'll have my differences in this, as I have raised them. Full disclosure, I used to work in the Western Cape government, so I know exactly what Helen's referring to in this regard. But let me maybe steer the conversation in a different direction. Helen, I asked you something earlier on when we were in the kitchen. Helen's a great cook, by the way. But Helen, I asked you a question which maybe spoke to the efforts that's now been put in the last 10 years. And, you know, when you delivered that State of the Province address on Friday, it is safe to say there would have been a child perhaps in any of the hospitals in the province being born at that particular time. That child is being born into a province that is run by the Democratic Alliance. It has been for the last 10 years. What is that child's life going to look like in the next 10 years? But it's irrelevant. Essentially, what is that child's life going to look like compared to a child who may have been born in another province in this country? Is there a DA difference?
I have no doubt that there is a DA difference, and quite a substantial DA difference, although obviously it's going to take another 10 to 15 years of good government to make sure that every child has an equal opportunity. The role of the government is to ensure that it guarantees everybody's rights and freedoms and ensures that people have opportunities to make the most of their lives. And so we have a responsibility to make sure that every child can get born in safety, that they're not damaged during the passage of birth, which is a perilous passage. And we largely get that right. We must make sure that children survive early childhood, which is not often the case in many poorer countries and certainly poorer communities. And so that is a huge government responsibility, postnatal care and antenatal care, of course. We have to make sure that children get their vaccinations, that there's a clinic that is able to do those follow-ups and ensure that they do. We have to ensure that child grants get to kids and that they are used for the children and not for other purposes. We have to ensure that there are pre-primaries subsidized by the state where children can get decent early childhood education at a reasonable level. We have to ensure that basic education functions and that children become literate and numerate. And of course, we put almost a third of our budget into that endeavor because it is so critically important. We have to ensure that, to the extent possible, children don't get sucked in by the regime of drugs and substance abuse. And so we've put an enormous effort into the infrastructure for helping children at risk of substance abuse, which is such a great risk. We have to ensure that children can gain access to further education and training, and that all along the way they have access to decent health care, that there's transport infrastructure, that there's a growing economy so that their parents can get jobs and look after them, so that they have all the opportunities through internet, through free access to Wi-Fi, to e-learning, to all the opportunities that other children get. And so that's where we've put our massive effort. And I think it is really beginning to show in the statistics. Job creation has unemployment is by far the lowest in the Western Cape, 14 percentage points lower than the national average on the expanded definition.
Just very quickly, and it surprises me that that's not the story that we're, for example, reading in the newspapers. I mean, that is a massive, massive, massive difference, compared to the rest of the country. It's the weird thing I just didn't see much of in the traditional media. But anyway.
Well, of course, as you know, it's the economy stupid, as people say. Absolutely. And people need jobs. Absolutely. Our biggest problem is poverty. And the only way out of poverty sustainably is investment, growth, and job creation. That's right. And our number one priority to ensure that children have had opportunities in the Western Cape is to ensure we create the conditions for confidence, for investment, for growth, and for jobs. And employment has grown 24% in the last 10 years, which is a lot higher than Gauteng at 16.6%, and KwaZulu-Natal, the other two big economies in South Africa. KwaZulu-Natal was a mere 6.6%. So we've had a 24% growth in employment. And that has been critical because we've had a lot of in-migration, which means that people have had jobs and can contribute to raising their children and can contribute to living a life they value. So everything pivots on jobs. And therefore, a government's top priority needs to be creating the conditions for investment and growth. But after that, when you get the tax revenue, you can use it for creating those opportunities so that children can use the economic environment through skills and through abilities and through their health.
Helen, as a final question, and again, I'm going straight for the jugular here. Helen, there is an argument that a classical liberal or libertarian like me would make and say, look, you've set up the foundation, so to speak, a culture of good governance, a culture of what is government's responsibility, it delivering on that. Personally, I think we do a bit too much as government in this province, but that's another debate for another day. But linked to that, if I were to put it to you and say, Helen, is there scope for going forward a DA government in this province which ever increasingly places more resources, more power in the hands of parents? Now, let me be precise and specific. Maybe in an example, what if I put it to you, Helen, and I said, well, maybe in the next term of government or the next term after that, the DA government could actually break up its health budget in the form of vouchers. I know you've tried this insofar as the collaboration schools idea, and I don't know if you want to speak on that, but essentially put the decision-making into the hands of a parent by way of a voucher, so that parent gets the chance to choose where they get their education from, and that the private sector then comes in much more, as we're seeing happen in this province, by the way, in terms of Kuro. In Gauteng, there's another group called the Spark Schools, which are fantastic, by the way. The parent essentially would have the decision as to where they take their child to get an education. You could do the same in healthcare, break up the budget, create a health insurance of sorts that allows people to shop around for their education. Would there be scope for something like that as a future, if a liberal is listening to this and goes, I want to be in government, I want to implement something like that, could you do something like that?
Oh yes, absolutely, and that is what we must do. We've started that with the collaboration schools, which have been very important. The key thing is good school governance.
That's right.
And if you give the parents choice, they know quality and they want to send their children there. The trouble is we've got a relatively small number of schools that really offer high quality, and the entire onus on the system is put on them. And when they can't accommodate everybody, as they obviously can't, then they have to take the brunt of all the attacks they get. So the job of government in education is to increase the supply of quality. And I completely agree with what you say there. What we need to do is make sure the budget follows the child. The budget needs to follow each child, and then we need to loosen up so the private sector can come in and offer that quality, and education partners can come and offer expertise and other subsidies to enable poor parents to make freer choices of quality and subject the system to much more competition so that people will know that they will not attract learners unless they are offering quality. And we're getting more and more into that. It's obviously cost us a hell of a lot of money. And the experiment so far has been really good. But what that requires is saying to the unions, you cannot control the choices in education. We have to have expertise, we have to have accountability, we have to have quality. And what we have done as the government now is introduced the Schools Evaluation Authority, which is a big thing. So basically what we're doing is we're going to evaluate schools on the basis of quality. So these are major, major changes where the government is playing its role to ensure the provision of quality and giving parents free choice in accessing that quality. And the more choice you give parents, the more they can vote with their feet, the more pressure you put on the governance of schools to up the quality because they don't have a captive audience and a captive market anymore.
Helen, thank you very much. And thank you for watching. I mean, this has been an absolute honor for me to interview Helen. Once again, Helen, thank you so much for your time and thank you for joining us on the Big Liberty Show. And guys, thank you again. Thank you for the support and for all the good messages and all the comments. I do read as many of them as I possibly can. But this has been the Big Liberty Show. Remember to like, share, comment, subscribe to the show. I'm on all your social media platforms. And as always, please keep supporting me. Become a friend of the Institute of Race Relations. It's your monthly contributions that help me get around the country to be able to, come to Leonhof, very fancy, and to come to communities where you are, so that we can have a conversation around this and begin to prosecute the battle of ideas in this country, because good ideas always win, but it needs those of us who are committed to building a property-owning and prosperous and freedom-loving society to get our voices into the fight, so to speak. But you can support the show by becoming a friend of the IRR. You do that by SMSing your name to 32823. Terms and conditions apply. Someone will give you a call back and sign you up. Or you can just find us online, irr.org.za/join. And as I said, the monthly contribution I get is about 90 Rand per person per month, and it goes a really long way to putting the show together and much, much more. Guys, thank you so much for joining me. I'm your favorite fat boy, Big Daddy Liberty, and you are watching The Big Liberty Show.